I would just encourage anyone to pick up, as much sign language as they can, try to make deaf friends. It's like a different culture, a different perspective on the world. We, hearing people, should be more aware of the barriers to information access that deaf people have to overcome. And the more people that learn sign language, the more accessible the hearing world will be. And if people are in a position to make information visibly available, like in written signage or through sign language interpreting, that would really go far to helping the deaf people join the majority culture. But at the same time, it's really interesting for us as hearing people to understand the perspectives from the deaf culture. It's about putting yourself in other people's shoes and realizing what is it like not to hear the incidental conversations that go on.
Marilyn Plumlee, this is so fun to talk to you. I'm really excited, and thank you so much for talking with me today. We met many years ago when we were both in grad school at the University of Hawaii. What I have to say is watching how you have lived your life since then has been fascinating to me, and I have really admired it, and I'm really excited to get to talk to you about it. You have lived and taught college all these years since grad school in Honolulu, South Korea, Egypt, and now Kazakhstan. And you lived for years in each of those places. How did that come about? Where did you grow up? And tell us about your family. Do you come from an international family that traveled all around the world?
Not at all, not at all. I was born in Wichita, Kansas. I always thought it was, plain Jane kind of Wichita, Kansas. And then at one point, someone that I met that was writing a book on multilingual people asked me to write the story of how I mastered various languages. And when I started to think about it, I realized there were international influences, but I didn't consider them international. Like we had a neighbor who was Greek, and around the corner, there was this grocery store, and people always said they're Assyrian. And they were just these nice men that had a butcher shop or whatever and a grocery store. And then I remember in high school, I had a friend who was Chinese, a Chinese second generation. And then very much a precursor of what was to come in my life, another one of our friends in our high school gang of friends, his mother was deaf. And it's really funny because I've ended up that deaf culture has been an important part of my life. So when I started to look back at my, high school years, your formative young teenage years, I realized I did have international influences, but it was just part of growing up in Wichita. Well, my mother had been a Latin teacher, so she had me take Latin. And then I was the only Latin student because it was kind of dying out. So I switched over to French. And when I switched to French, it was like, wow, the world opened to me. And we had a French teacher she was from Arkansas, and she had an Arkansas accent in English, and she had an Arkansas accent in French. So I don't think I got a very good accent, it wasn't a Parisian accent, but she was wonderful about presenting culture. And she kind of opened the doors. And when one summer I was going to study in Quebec, and she put me in touch with a Quebec family that she knew. And that was my very first step abroad, was going to Quebec, Canada for a summer intensive language program where you had to promise not to speak any English. And they came around, it was like a dormitory with nuns, and the nuns came around every night to make sure you weren't chatting in French with your friends and stuff like that. So basically, I would say it was the fact that I took French in high school, which opened the doors to me, and the cultural initiation that Madame Larimer, we always called her Madame Larimer, gave to us.
So your fields of study and interest are sociolinguistics and sign language. And I wanted to ask you about how you got connected with deaf culture, which I know is a very significant part of your life.
I was living in France, so jump ahead from that time. I grew up in Kansas. I went to the University of Kansas. I majored in French and German. I lived a year in Germany, and I just loved this life in Europe. I almost didn't go back. I applied for a graduate scholarship to Paris, so I ended up going to Paris and studying. And then one day in the newspaper, there was this advertisement that said, looking for someone speaking English, French, and German, knowledge of American and European secondary or education systems. And I said, I've studied in Germany, I've studied in France, I am from America, I speak these three languages. So I applied and got this wonderful job as at that time, it was the coordinator of a German and American high school exchange program, but eventually kind of moved up the ranks, and I became the director of what's called the School Exchange Service with the Council on International Educational Exchange. So I worked with them for about 10, 11 years. And as part of that, one day we got an email. This was way before email. we would have gotten a telex at that time saying, well, there's this deaf couple from the University of Washington. This was the international study advisor from the University of the UW in Seattle. And he said, there's this deaf couple coming to Paris and we'd like them to touch base with you. They're planning to spend a couple months in Europe traveling around learning about deaf culture in Europe. So my boss at the time is the one who actually received this letter, this telex. And she said, Marilyn, I'm going to have dinner with these deaf couple. Why don't you come to my house because you're more their age? I think I was about 22, 23 at the time. So I said, deaf culture, deaf people, what? I didn't know anything about deaf culture or sign language, but I went to dinner, and in the course of events throughout that dinner, I realized we could communicate. They were in and out of Paris over the next month or so, and we became very good friends. 2 or 3 years later, a friend of theirs who was studying at Gallaudet University, which is the only university in the world for deaf undergrads, came to Paris, and they said, when you go to Paris, buy a bouquet of flowers, take it to Marilyn, say hello from us. So I met their friend whose name was Linda, and Linda and I chatted and whatnot, and then we kept in touch. One summer I was traveling around America. There's another story there. Like in those days, TWA, I think it was, offered for like $99 you could travel all around and put 17 cities on your itinerary. So with a friend we were traveling. Where do you want to go? Well, no, this friend had a sister in Seattle, so I said, okay, you go to Seattle to visit your sister, and I know these deaf people up on this island, Lummi Island, which is very close out of Bellingham, close to Canada. I'll go visit my friends, the deaf friends. And I went up there, and my original friends, Betty and Glenn, were there, but Linda had left. And I said, well, where's Linda? And they said, oh, she went off to Hollywood with a deaf Polish mime. And I said, oh, well, I'm going to be in Los Angeles next time. So, on my next itinerary of 17 cities. And so they gave me the contact for Linda, and I met Linda and her, at that point, boyfriend. And this is really where it all started. We connected. I was going to spend 2 or 3 days in LA. I ended up with that special ticket. I could extend my stay. I stayed a week, I think. And they began to teach me sign language, and we became very close, and we had wonderful communication. And the next year came around, and they were getting married, and they invited me to their wedding, and I went. And after the wedding, Linda sat me down. She and her husband at this point said, we'd like you to stay here in America, and we want you to be the manager of, his stage name was Miko, or is Miko. And I said, well, I can do that. Let's see what happens. So we were in their VW bus, and we drove all the way from Washington State via Montana down to Los Angeles. And the rest is kind of history, as we say. So I lived with them. It was kind of immersion. I took classes. I was constantly using sign language, and I learned sign language and became his manager. And that was the beginning of my connection to deaf culture, but very intensively.
Did you tell me that you know 4 different sign languages?
Okay, well, American Sign Language, which is the one that I used. I always go, American Sign Language is the one I know the best. Then I know bits of French, or more than bits, but French Sign Language, bits, I would say bits of Korean Sign Language. And mostly with all these international people, I use International Sign, which is not International Sign Language, but it is an ad hoc kind of a pidgin, you could say. When you have a first encounter, it is a kind of pidgin. You use whatever that person knows, whatever their sign is, and if you have any common signs with American Sign Language or whatever. Very much like English is the lingua franca for people all over the world. In sign language, in deaf culture, American Sign Language or French Sign Language, they're quite closely related, are kind of the lingua franca. So you can borrow from American Sign Language. It's quite well known. So I do International Sign. If there are people who are also internationally minded and have lots of international friends, they also do International Sign, and we understand each other perfectly. My good Korean deaf friend who just finished his PhD in linguistics did his whole study with all his professors. He did his PhD defense, all of this in International Sign. So you can express very specific abstract concepts, as well as, like first encounter, kind of where are you from, where'd you grow up, who are your parents, what's your country. You can do the basic get acquainted stuff, but you can also, with experience, express everything up to a PhD in linguistics. linguistics and international sign.
So after you got out of university in Kansas, you lived in France. What were you doing there?
I went on a graduate scholarship as an assistante américaine to a particular French university. And then I did study there, political science. And then I got this job that I was talking about. I did other odd jobs and taught languages and stuff. I taught German to French. I taught English to French. And I was a guide in Paris at one point for school groups. And they told me not to let them know I was American. I would just either speak German or French to them. And
did that work? Did they know you were American, or were you good at that?
No, I mean, I would never tell them until the very last day, or sometimes I didn't tell them at all. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Deaf culture it's a minority culture within any country. Deaf people are a minority. It is a linguistic culture, and like any language, it creates bonds. And I mean, the language is the vehicle of the culture, but the language also creates a culture because of these bonds. There are certain customs, and I would just say to people who are not familiar with deaf culture that it's like a new world. It's like a new country. And I think Steven Pinker, the famous neuropsychologist at Harvard and MIT, he wrote a book. It was translated into French, and I've read it in French. It's Au Pays des Sourds, in the land of the deaf. And I'm not sure if that's exactly the title in English, but you can look for Steven Pinker and the book that he wrote describing how he was introduced to deaf culture by deaf people. And it's like stepping into another country. And of course, you're using a different language. And one of the most urgent issues in deaf culture is education for deaf children. That so many deaf children in America, it's better than in most other places, but around the world, in Kazakhstan, for example, deaf children are going to school and the teacher just writes on the board, they copy in their notebook, and the teacher comes around and see if they copied perfectly from the board, and that's considered education. Like, they don't get real conversation. The teachers don't do sign language. Deaf children don't necessarily read lips. How to read lips if you don't know the language originally, and even if you do know the language, it's hard to read lips. If I speak like this, how much are you going to understand? Even if you know English. And what I said was, when someone just talks like that and all you can see is the lips, you don't really catch very much of what they're saying. It's very difficult to try to lip read, especially for a child who doesn't actually know the language that's coming out of the lips, right? I would just recommend people to maybe read up. There's a really nice, it's an older thing. I think it was written in 1989, but it's a very kind of a classic. Sherman Wilcox, who was a professor at the University of New Mexico, wrote this one. It's called American Deaf Culture. And it's like a collection of pieces contributed by deaf leaders. And there's another newer book written by a British deaf person called Deafhood. And for people who are interested in scholarly things, it's like a almost 600-page book. It's amazing. He coined this word himself. And it's everything from the beginnings of deafness, what back in ancient Greece, what people thought of deafness or deaf people, all the way up through you could say the abuses of the educational system against deaf children. It's an amazing book. Deafhood. I would recommend it to anybody that's all interested in deaf culture. I could talk for hours.
Thanks for listening. We post videos of interesting people with interesting lives every Tuesday. Stay tuned for more with Marilyn coming up. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe.